Hi there, my name is Ewan Nicholson. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Remembering Love. If you're new to this channel, this is a channel where we look at the subjects and themes of healing childhood trauma, complex PTSD, and all the various other things in between. So if you're interested in those things, you like those things, please like and subscribe. If you're not new to this channel, welcome back. Now today we're going to be looking at the subject of what is the benefits and cost regarding getting a diagnosis for complex PTSD, also known as C-PTSD, or complex trauma. And throughout this video I'll be trying to refer it to as complex trauma because it's just a lot easier to pronounce than C-PTSD. So in this video there's a few things I'm going to be going through. To begin with, we're going to be looking just a basic definition. When we talk about complex PTSD, what are we actually talking about? I'd like to go through the process of getting a diagnosis, like how do you get one, what's involved in being diagnosed with complex trauma, and then I'd like to run through what's the benefit, like why get a diagnosis, what's the value of being diagnosed with complex trauma, and then also to look at what I would consider some of the costs, or maybe cost isn't the right word, some of the things to keep in mind when it comes to that diagnosis. So to begin with, when we talk about complex trauma, what are we actually talking about? So here's a very basic definition. What is complex post-traumatic stress disorder? Complex post-traumatic stress disorder, C-PTSD, also known as complex trauma disorder, is a psychological disorder that can develop in response to prolonged, repeated experience of interpersonal trauma in a context in which the individual has little or no chance of escape. So what you see in this definition is what distinguishes C-PTSD from PTSD is complex trauma usually occurs over a long period of time. It's often interpersonal. And it's often in this environment we can't escape. It could be a kidnap situation, it could be an abusive domestic violent relationship, but often it's in childhood, because our childhood, our family of origin is definitely, for most of us, a place we cannot escape. So the most common place that complex trauma occurs is in childhood. And it's also related to interpersonal relationships. Often the abuse, neglect, violence is occurring with people we know. It isn't random acts of violence, it's occurring within a family system and it's occurring in a prolonged period of time. So I read a good definition is complex trauma is when you're marinated in stress, where post-traumatic stress disorder is often a single event trauma that leaves this intense residue and reverberation in the person's life. Complex trauma is this same kind of single event trauma happening over and over and over and over and over, which is a very good description of someone being sexually abused or physically abused over a long period of time in their childhood. And when that occurs, what they now understand is that has this reverberating effect psychologically to the point where it's now being classified as a disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, that has symptoms and issues that come with it that are unique to that. So that is what we understand to be complex trauma. So if you think you have complex trauma or you imagine you may have complex trauma, what's involved in getting a diagnosis? Now this part gets a little bit tricky because on one level, if you go on Google and you search complex trauma or C-PTSD and you look at what causes it, what are the symptoms, most people can probably look at that and think, well, these symptoms match what I have. The phenomena they're describing during childhood is kind of what I went through. So if I piece these things together, I guess I have complex trauma, and that may well be accurate. But my advice would be is this is a very serious thing that you don't. If you've got a rash on your toe, maybe you go into Google and you can self-diagnose yourself. But when it comes to this particular issue, it's worth going to a licensed therapist, a professional that has the capacity to make that diagnosis in a professional way. And there's two reasons for that. One is it's an acknowledgement of the reality of it, that if you really think this is you, then you need healing. We all do. And by going to a licensed professional and looking for that diagnosis or getting a professional to assess you in that regards, you're kind of acknowledging to yourself the seriousness of the issue, because complex trauma is serious. And often we end up looking for some diagnosis, because our lives have got to a certain point where we think, what the hell's going on? Why am I this way? So my advice would be is to get a diagnosis, a professional diagnosis. I've had it done. I didn't get a certificate or anything, or a thing I can put on my wall to say I've got it, but I did get a formal diagnosis to say this is exactly what I have. And I would recommend that if you really feel like it matches, don't diagnose yourself on Google. Now, the tricky bit about all mental health diagnoses is it's not a blood test. If you think you have, potentially type 2 diabetes, you can do a glucose test on a fast. If it's within this range, you're pre-diabetic. If it's in that range, you're diabetic. You get that test done 2 weeks later, and if you get the same results, you're officially have type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes. It's very matter of fact. It's just, this score and this range. When it comes to depression, anxiety, complex trauma, it's a series of psychological and emotional symptoms that build up as a pattern over a period of time. There is no lab test. There is no diagnosis that can be run on your blood. It is really analyzing and assessing your behavior, your patterns, your habits, and where you have come to. So, that's the nature of how we diagnose mental illness, and it has its issues on one level. And often people that end up with a diagnosis of complex trauma, before they get that final diagnosis, they're being diagnosed with depression and anxiety or all sorts of things. And one of the great benefits of a diagnosis, which I'll come to in a second, is it often answers issues that we've previously been struggling with, because the diagnosis of complex trauma is often what I consider to be a root diagnosis. It's a diagnosis that is very much the root of a lot of other issues, certainly for myself. So in terms of my own anxiety, my own depression, my own addiction issues, I can all trace them back to my complex trauma. So getting the diagnosis is not like a blood test thing, but it is possible to be able to look at your history, to look at where you've come to look at your symptoms, to look at your childhood, and piece it all together and get a professional to say, yes, this is what you have, and to be able to kind of move forward from there. So let's imagine you've been given a diagnosis, or you actually thought, all you had was depression. Turns out you're actually being diagnosed with complex trauma. What's the value of that? What's the benefit of that diagnosis? So to me, there are a few things I like to go through. First of all is just insight and understanding. And I think one of the things that diagnosis gives you is a feeling of, okay, that makes sense. That when I do this thing here, it's because of this thing over here. That getting an understanding of the architecture and framework of why we do what we do gives us a feeling that we're not crazy, we're not faulty, we're not effed up. We've actually developed very normal responses to abnormal circumstances. And that, in my experience and my understanding, is that all mental illness, in inverted commas, are adaptations to abnormal environments and abnormal situations, that they're actually in their own way healthy and understandable ways to cope with pain and suffering and trauma, essentially. So when you get the diagnosis to say you have complex trauma, a lot of things start to make sense. The things that you can't do, the things that you do, the way you sabotage this, your addiction issues, your disassociation, suddenly it's all pieced together in a framework that feels clear and makes sense. So I think from that regards, to feel like, well, I'm not crazy or I'm not faulty, that this all makes sense within the framework of this diagnosis, I think is a really good thing. To be able to say, I've got a name for it, there's a set of symptoms, and these are all common things that occur. This isn't just something's wrong with me. Something has gone wrong, something should have happened that didn't, something happened that shouldn't have, and now this is where I'm at, and this explains it. And I think to get that feeling of explanation, of understanding, is very powerful. And for that reason, I think it can be a really helpful thing to be diagnosed with complex trauma. The second thing, which kind of leads on from that, is once you have that diagnosis, once you understand, this is why I do what I do, this is how I ended up where I am, you then can seek the right and appropriate treatment and healing for that issue and the issue of complex trauma. Because complex trauma is its own thing. It has its own treatment protocol, and it is developing rapidly. There are more and more new things coming out about it. And when it comes to treating complex trauma, what I've experienced is, in the world of psychologists and psychotherapists, definitely psychiatrists, there is very little knowledge of it. There's a lot of ignorance on one level, because the nature of how universities and academia work, they're often very far behind the cutting edge of what's coming out about trauma. So you may go to a psychotherapist or a psychologist and they've got a background in cognitive behavior therapy, which isn't really suitable to healing and treating complex trauma. So once you get that definition and once you get that diagnosis, you can look for people who specialize in treating complex trauma, people that have not only their degree in psychology, but they've done further education in the more cutting edge treatments, from trauma release exercises to safe and sound protocol, which I've covered in other videos, and those type of things. So you can seek out the professionals that are better suited to treating what it is you're actually dealing with. And in addition to seeking out professionals, you can also look at educating yourself, in terms of what you read and what you understand about your own process. So in addition to finding a therapist that has an expertise in treating complex trauma, once you have that diagnosis, you can do your own research. You can read up on what it is and how to treat it better. So for instance, if you're looking at finding a therapist, you would want the therapist to have some knowledge or understanding of these two books. This one here, The Body Keeps Score. This one here, The Body Remembers. So if you're talking to a psychotherapist or a psychologist regarding the treatment of your trauma and they have never heard of those books, they have no idea about what they are, personally, I would be looking at someone else, because those books are really at the cutting edge of understanding our nervous system, polyvagal theory, and looking at treating complex trauma as an issue of the nervous system as much as the mind and the emotions. And that's an advantage of having the diagnosis. Once you know that you have complex trauma, you can look at getting the treatment and healing that is at the most advanced, the most cutting edge, and the most effective in dealing with what you have. So that's another advantage. And in addition to that, you can do your own reading. And part of two books I could recommend, which is Accessing the Healing Power of the Vagus Nerve, which again is looking at how we treat our nervous system in regards to treating trauma. And another one, which is very popular among survivors, it's probably less popular among therapists, which is Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving. I mean, I know a lot of people with complex trauma that love that book. I liked it. I wouldn't say it's like the best ever, but I know a lot of people that just thought it was the kind of bee's knees. So that diagnosis can give you that ability to do your own research, learn more and more and more, and find therapists that are best suited to a treatment that can really work for you. So let's look at some of what I would consider to be the costs, or some of the potential issues when it comes to a diagnosis of complex trauma. Now, I think for sure the benefits outweigh the costs, and the costs are kind of more broader things to be aware of rather than like problems you've got to kind of weigh up. And to me, one of the issues is not getting too identified with a diagnosis. And I think it happens to all of us. Once we understand something and it clicks, we get very into it. I certainly do, and I have complex trauma and we kind of immerse ourselves in that. But there comes a certain point, for me at least, where I feel like, look, that's really helped me. It's definitely something that has enabled me to deal with it more effectively, but I'm not my complex trauma. Like, complex trauma isn't who I am. It's an understanding and a framework that makes sense to me. It's a diagnosis that I can use and it helps facilitate healing, but it's not at the heart of who I am. And I feel like labels are one of these things that have a value to a point, but also I'm more than my trauma. I'm more than having complex trauma. And I think it's important with any diagnosis, whether it's alcoholism, depression, anxiety, disassociation, that we don't get too lost in these definitions and labels where we start feeling identified like that's kind of who I am. And I think there is a little bit of a danger in that. I think it's certainly, for me, there was a period of time where I felt very kind of obsessed or very fixated on this issue. Then maybe some of us just outgrow it naturally, but I also feel like there's a certain point where I had to kind of make a decision that, yeah, I'm not that, and I am that, but that's not all of me, and I don't want that to define my whole life. And my healing journey is bigger than just, I've got complex trauma and I need to kind of heal. It's more, for me, more transcendent and broader, and it encompasses a lot of things. Because at the end of the day, the diagnosis of complex trauma is a labeling and understanding of a particular type of pain. But the pain of being alive, and I did another video on, you're human, there's no cure for that. There is a pain that accompanies just being human that we can't get away from, that everyone has. And our pain as survivors with complex trauma is a particularly nuanced pain, has a particular kind of signature or feel to it, but it's just part of the human deal. It's part of being here. We suffer, we deal with things. You can have no complex trauma, but if the person you love and you're married to dies of cancer, that's extremely painful. You can have no complex trauma and someone you love betrays and hurts you, that's painful. So there is pain seems to be part of our existence, and there's just no getting away from that. And complex trauma describes a certain type of pain. It describes a certain phenomena that arise from that pain. But at the end of the day, it is just part of being human, and I try to keep that in mind when it comes to the diagnosis. The second thing to be aware of is diagnoses and understandings evolve. So what we understand about trauma right now, about complex trauma, its treatment, its symptoms, there is a kind of a cutting edge or a kind of like the most advanced up-to-date knowledge is this. But you just have to assume 50 years from now it's going to be very different. Maybe there'll be a new name for it. Maybe they're aware of some other thing that affects it, as it was leaching, as a treatment for illness 500 years ago probably was at the cutting edge of medical treatment back then. We look back and they used leeches to treat people, but I'm sure at the time it was advanced and was based on a certain understanding or knowledge that made sense at the time. So I also keep into account that this definition of complex trauma, this treatment protocol of complex trauma is to do with where we are right now, 2021. But if humanity survives the next 100 years or the next 200 years, we just have to assume it's going to be very different. So I also don't get too fixated on, it's this and I have to do that and this is the only way to treat it, because it's going to evolve. It is going to change. It's going to morph. So I'm also aware that not to get too rigid about that. So look, I hope this has helped. I hope this has made sense to you. If you feel you have potentially complex trauma, I would look it up. I would seek some professional advice and insight and support on that. Thank you very much for coming to my YouTube channel. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Take care and look after yourself. Bye bye.